The silent streets. The city was cloaked in a cold embrace that night. The sky overhead was a pale gray, as if the heavens themselves had been drained of their color. The chill in the air sent a shiver down Harrison's spine as he walked through the park, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The harsh wind seemed to carry whispers from the shadows, carrying with it the heavy weight of tragedy that had taken root in the city's heart. Harrison had always loved the stillness of the park at night, the way the trees swayed in the wind like solemn guardians. But tonight, the park felt different. It was as though the very ground he walked on was haunted, soaked with grief and despair. In the past few months, there had been a wave of brutal murders, each victim a reminder of the cruel world that seemed to surround him. Black men and women, young and old, had been gunned down without mercy, their lives snuffed out in a city that no longer felt like home. Every crime scene he had visited, every family he had consoled, had taken a piece of him. Harrison wasn't a stranger to death, he had seen it in many forms during his career as a seasoned police officer, but this relentless wave of senseless killings, gnawed at him. Each victim's face was imprinted in his mind, their stories unfinished, their lives taken too soon. He had become more than just an officer to these victims, he had become a witness to the unraveling of the city itself. As he rounded a corner of the park, Harrison's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of empty benches and the children's play structures, usually a place of laughter and joy. Tonight, however, the playground appeared more like a forgotten relic, cast in shadow, its swings gently creaking in the wind, as if mourning the absence of the innocent lives that should have been here. His boots made soft, deliberate sounds against the gravel path as he continued his patrol. His breath came out in visible puffs, the cold biting at his skin, but his mind was focused elsewhere, on the series of murders that had been weighing heavily on his thoughts. He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he almost missed her. At first, it was only a slight movement in the corner of his eye, a shift in the darkness that caught his attention. He stopped, his instincts kicking in. Something was wrong. Harrison turned his head slowly, his flashlight narrowing in on the small form huddled near the base of the jungle gym. The figure was barely visible at first, almost blending into the shadows as though trying to remain unnoticed. As his beam of light landed on the girl, Harrison felt a jolt of disbelief. She was small, far too small to be out here alone. Her body was curled tightly against the ground, her limbs drawn inward for warmth, her face hidden in the folds of a tattered hoodie that was too big for her. She appeared no older than 10, her skin pale against the dark backdrop of the night, her hair matted and unkempt. Harrison's heart tightened as he approached cautiously, the distant sound of his footsteps echoing in the silent park. Something about her stillness, her vulnerability, sent a cold chill down his spine. The city was no stranger to runaways, especially children, but this was different. There was a palpable fear in the air, a rawness in the way she held herself. It was as though she was trying to disappear into the ground, to become one with the darkness. He stopped a few feet away from her, unsure of how to approach without startling her further. His voice was soft, gentle, as he spoke into the night. "Hey there, are you okay?" For a moment, there was no response, only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Then, the girl's head shot up, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at him as though she had been caught in some unseen trap. Harrison immediately noticed the raw fear in her expression, the wildness in her eyes. She was trembling, her lips parting to speak but nothing coming out. Before he could take another step, she scrambled to her feet with alarming speed, her hands flailing as if trying to push him away without touching him. Her movements were frantic, jerky, as though she had experienced enough pain in her life to make her instinctively distrust anyone who came too close. "Wait!" Harrison called softly, taking a step forward. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just trying to help. What's your name?" The girl's eyes darted around the park as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. The streets were silent, empty, and cold. Harrison took another slow step toward her, trying to make himself appear less threatening, to show that he meant no harm. "I'm a police officer," he said, lowering his voice even more. "My name is Harrison. You don't have to be scared." The girl's chest rose and fell rapidly as she continued to take small, panicked steps backward. Her gaze shifted nervously, flickering back to him as though she was weighing her options. "Please, I just need to know you're all right. Can I help you?" Harrison's heart ached at the sight of her distress. Every instinct told him to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew he couldn't push her. "Not yet." The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go with you." "Please, I can't." Harrison's stomach twisted. There was something in her voice that told him she had seen too much, things that no child should ever have to see. Something about the way she spoke made his heart sink, and he realized that it wasn't just fear she was battling. It was something much darker. He slowly crouched down to her level, lowering his hands to show that he was no threat. "I'm not going to make you go anywhere you don't want to. But I can help you. You don't have to be out here alone. It's too dangerous." The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the ground, her fingers clenching the fabric of her hoodie. It was clear she didn't trust him. How could she? The world had failed her in every way possible. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke again, but this time her voice was filled with a quiet resignation. "My name's Josie," she said, almost in a whisper. Josie. The name felt like a fragile promise in the cold night. Harrison felt a pang of sorrow for this little girl who had been left alone in the world, cast aside like debris in the storm. He could see the terror in her eyes, but there was something else too, something that resembled a flicker of hope, buried deep beneath layers of pain. Harrison stood up, his heart heavy. "Josie, I'm not going to leave you here. You're not alone anymore. I'm going to take you somewhere safe. I promise." But Josie didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, fear, and a silent plea for something she could no longer remember, the simple comfort of safety. He could see that she didn't believe him. And who could blame her? In a world where children like Josie were forgotten, ignored, and abandoned, trust was a luxury that few could afford. "I'm not going to hurt you," Harrison repeated softly. "I'm going to take you home with me, and I'm going to make sure you're okay." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before Josie took a tentative step forward. Slowly, as if testing the waters, she reached for his hand. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, Harrison felt something stir deep within him, a glimmer of hope that, perhaps, he could make a difference. He extended his hand, and Josie, trembling but trusting, placed her small fingers in his. "Let's go," he said softly, leading her away from the darkness of the park and into the warmth of the unknown. The shelter of kindness. The journey back to Harrison's apartment was quiet, with the only sounds being the hum of the car's engine and the occasional soft rustling of Josie shifting in the seat beside him. Harrison glanced at her every few moments, his heart aching at the sight of her small, trembling form, her eyes distant and haunted. She hadn't spoken much during the ride, her gaze locked outside the window, her eyes tracking the passing streetlights as if each one was a marker, an anchor in the desolate sea of her mind. She was lost, trapped somewhere far away, and Harrison couldn't help but feel like an intruder in her world of grief. The car's headlights illuminated the narrow streets, casting long shadows along the sidewalk, stretching out as if trying to reach them. Harrison took a deep breath, pushing aside the weight of the cases he had been working on earlier. Tonight, those files would have to wait. There was something more urgent now, something that tugged at his soul and demanded his attention. Josie needed him. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew that he couldn't abandon her now, not after everything she had been through. As they pulled into the parking lot of his building, Harrison killed the engine and sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what kind of future Josie had, or if she even wanted a future at all. All he knew was that he had to try to help her. It was a small promise, but it was all he could offer. Josie didn't move when the car stopped. She just sat there, her hands in her lap, her face still blank, her body stiff with the same guarded tension he had seen in her when they first met. Harrison sighed softly, his heart breaking for her again. This child had seen the darkest sides of life, and he didn't know how to erase that pain. He just knew he had to be there for her, even if she didn't want it. "Josie," Harrison said, his voice a quiet invitation. "We're here. You don't have to be afraid." At the sound of his voice, Josie finally shifted, glancing at him briefly before looking back down at her hands. Harrison didn't press. Instead, he opened the car door and stepped out, walking around to her side to open it for her. "Come on, let's get you inside," he said gently, offering her his hand. For a moment, Josie hesitated, her small fingers trembling as they hovered above the door handle. Harrison waited patiently, allowing her to take the lead, to choose when to trust. After what felt like a long silence, Josie finally took his hand. Her touch was light, fragile, but it was enough. The apartment building loomed ahead, its brick walls weathered by time, the stairwell lined with old, chipped paint. It was modest, nothing like the homes Josie might have imagined for herself before all this. The thought of what she had lost twisted something deep inside Harrison. He didn't know what kind of life she had before the tragedy, but the silence in her eyes told him it had been one of warmth and love. Whatever that had been, it was gone now. They climbed the stairs in silence, the weight of their shared experience pressing down on them both. Harrison's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan, but all he could focus on was getting Josie somewhere safe, somewhere she could feel protected again. His apartment was small, but it was enough. The living room was modest, with a worn couch and a couple of mismatched chairs, a coffee table piled high with newspapers, and a bookshelf cluttered with books. It wasn't much, but it was home. "Here we are," Harrison said, opening the door. "This is where you'll stay. You're safe here, Josie. I promise." Josie stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail as though measuring the space for danger. She looked at the couch, the chair in the corner, the small kitchen with its aging appliances. It wasn't much, but Harrison could see her mentally assessing every corner, every potential hiding place. Her survival instincts were on high alert. "Do you want some water? Or something to eat?" Harrison asked, his voice calm, trying to break through her silence. Josie shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. She wasn't ready yet. She hadn't spoken a word since they left the park, and Harrison wasn't sure what it would take to get her to open up again. But he knew that rushing her wasn't the answer. She needed time to feel safe, time to feel like she wasn't running anymore. Instead of pushing her, Harrison took a step back, giving her space. "Okay. You can rest for now. I'll make sure you're comfortable." Josie wandered over to the couch and sat down, curling up with her knees tucked under her chin. Harrison watched her for a moment, his heart breaking at the sight of her tiny form, so alone in the world. He didn't know what kind of nightmares she was battling inside her mind, but he could guess. She was lost, stuck in a past that haunted her every step, trapped in memories too painful to relive. For the rest of the evening, Harrison kept his distance, moving quietly around the apartment, cooking a simple dinner and leaving it on the counter in case she decided she was hungry. He had no expectations, but he didn't want her to feel abandoned, either. He hoped that, over time, she might begin to feel comfortable here, might begin to believe that this was a place where she could find some peace. The silence between them stretched on, but slowly, ever so slowly, Harrison began to notice small signs of change. The way Josie's shoulders relaxed slightly, the way her gaze would linger on him for just a moment longer, as though she was starting to trust him a little. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Later that night, after the sun had long since set, Harrison sat at the kitchen table, reading through some paperwork. He couldn't help but glance over at Josie, who had finally fallen asleep on the couch. Her small form was curled tightly, her face still locked in the grip of some unseen nightmare. Harrison's heart ached, but he knew that healing wouldn't happen overnight. It couldn't. But he was determined to be there for her as long as she needed him. The hours ticked by, and Harrison finally turned off the lights and made his way to bed, his mind still racing with thoughts of Josie. He didn't know where this road would lead, didn't know if she would ever be able to fully trust him, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her face the darkness alone. And as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope, fragile and tenuous but there nonetheless. Maybe, just maybe, this girl who had lost so much could find her way back to something good. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to help her. Beneath the silence. The days following Josie's arrival in Harrison's apartment were filled with quiet, tentative steps, both for her and for him. Every morning, Harrison would wake up early, preparing a simple breakfast, toast with jam, eggs scrambled lightly. He wasn't sure what Josie liked to eat. She hadn't said a word to him in days, and every time he attempted to engage with her, she would retreat deeper into herself, as though the act of speaking was something too painful to bear. Harrison knew better than to push her, so he let her be. He respected her space, but that didn't stop his mind from racing with questions. How had she ended up on that park bench? What horrors had she witnessed? And most of all, how had she survived it all? On the fourth morning, Josie came to the kitchen. She didn't say anything, she never did, but she quietly sat at the table, her gaze distant as she watched him prepare their breakfast. Her eyes, once filled with raw fear, seemed calmer now, but they still held that same haunted look, like she was looking through him rather than at him. Harrison placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't want to startle her, but he also didn't want to treat her like she was fragile, as though she might break. He had learned early on that Josie wasn't fragile. She was a survivor. But her silence, that was something deeper. Something that he couldn't touch. She didn't reach for the food right away, as though she was unsure whether it was really meant for her. For a long moment, she just stared at the plate. Harrison didn't say anything, he didn't want to rush her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Josie picked up her fork, moving slowly, cautiously. She took a bite. It wasn't much, a small act, insignificant to anyone else, but to Harrison, it felt like a victory. For the next few days, their routine continued in much the same way. Harrison would prepare meals, and Josie would eat them, albeit in silence. Sometimes, she would look out the window, her eyes fixed on something only she could see, something far away. Harrison learned not to interrupt her moments of solitude. He didn't need her to talk, not yet. But he began to notice little changes. Small things, like how Josie would linger longer over her breakfast, or how she began to look at him a little longer, her gaze softening ever so slightly. The silence wasn't as oppressive anymore. It was just, still. One evening, as Harrison was tidying up the living room, Josie ventured into the room, her small figure standing just outside the kitchen. She watched him for a long time, as though unsure whether to join him or not. Harrison paused, glancing at her from across the room. "You're not bothering me, Josie," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Come sit down if you want. I don't mind." At first, she hesitated. Then, as if making a decision, she walked over to the couch, sitting down on the edge. She was still so small, so fragile-looking, and Harrison could see the way she tucked her hands into the sleeves of her hoodie, as though trying to disappear. He knew she wasn't ready to speak. And he didn't push. Instead, he went back to his task, moving slowly and with purpose. As he was putting a book on the shelf, he noticed Josie's eyes flicking toward the window. Her gaze was fixed on something outside, something invisible to him, but very real to her. It made Harrison wonder what kind of world she was seeing in her mind. What memories she was trapped in. The thought of her being haunted by such images brought a sharp sting to his chest. He wanted to protect her, to take away whatever darkness was lurking in her past, but how could he? How could he possibly help someone so broken, when he didn't even know where the pieces went? He finished tidying up the room and walked over to her, standing for a moment before he spoke. "I know you don't want to talk, and I get it. But I just want you to know that, you don't have to be scared anymore. Not here. Not with me." Josie didn't reply. She didn't even look at him. But he didn't need her to say anything. He could see it in her eyes, the slightest shift, a softening of the tension that had held her captive for so long. He knew, in that moment, that she was starting to believe him. Maybe just a little. The next few days, Harrison continued his careful balance of distance and support. He didn't push Josie to engage, but he made sure she always had food, clothes, and a warm bed. He would leave her alone when she needed it, but he was always nearby, just a room away, ready to listen if she ever wanted to speak. And then, one day, it happened. It was late afternoon when Josie finally spoke to him, truly spoke to him, for the first time in nearly a week. Harrison had been reading a book in the living room, the sound of the pages turning the only noise in the apartment, when Josie walked over to him, standing silently at the edge of the couch. Harrison looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them charged with unspoken words. "Can I ask you something?" Josie's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but there was a crack in it, a vulnerability that caught Harrison off guard. "Of course," he said, sitting up straighter, his attention fully on her. Her small hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve as she gathered her courage. Why are you helping me?" Harrison's heart skipped a beat. It was a question he had been asking himself ever since he found her in the park. He had never thought to put it into words. But now, as he looked at Josie, he realized the answer was clear. "Because you matter," Harrison said simply, his voice steady, though his heart felt raw. "Because no one should be alone in the world. And you don't have to be." Josie's eyes searched his face, as though weighing the truth of his words. And for the first time since she arrived, she smiled. It wasn't much, a fleeting curl of her lips, but it was a smile, a sign that she was beginning to believe in the possibility of something good. She sat down beside him on the couch, a few inches away at first, but with each passing moment, she gradually closed the distance. The quiet was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't full of fear. It was just a space they shared. For the rest of that evening, Josie stayed close by his side, her presence no longer just a shadow in the room but a small, tentative spark of hope. Harrison sat quietly, reading his book, but his mind was on Josie. He knew that her journey was far from over. There were still dark days ahead. There would be times when she would retreat into herself, when the silence would feel heavy again. But in that moment, he couldn't help but feel that, perhaps, they were starting to find their way back from the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, they could both heal. Facing the past. The days turned into weeks, and life in Harrison's apartment had settled into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was more peaceful than either of them had known in a long time. The apartment, once just a quiet place of solitude for Harrison, had transformed into something that felt like home, though it was still a fragile thing, held together by the unspoken bond between him and Josie. Josie had begun to participate more in the day-to-day activities, though still with a quiet reluctance. She would help Harrison with the dishes, but she never stayed to chat afterward. She would sit on the couch for hours, sometimes reading, sometimes staring out the window, her mind far away. Harrison respected her space but always made sure she knew he was there if she needed him. The silence between them, which had once been so heavy, began to feel more comfortable, as if it were the space they shared in order to heal. They had learned not to force the other to speak, but instead, simply to be. It was a delicate balance, one that Harrison hoped would last, even if he knew the healing process would take longer than either of them could anticipate. Then came the day that everything began to shift. It started out like any other day, the sun rising over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. Harrison had been awake for hours, finishing up some work on his computer while Josie slept in her room, the sound of her steady breathing a reminder of the fragility of the life she was still rebuilding. He glanced at the clock and decided it was time to wake her. When he opened her bedroom door, he was surprised to find the room empty. The bed was untouched, and Josie wasn't in her usual spot by the window. Panic gripped him for a moment as he wondered if something had happened. But then he heard the faint sound of crying, soft and muffled, coming from the living room. Harrison's heart dropped as he rushed toward the sound, only to stop at the sight of Josie curled up on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her face hidden in her hands as silent sobs shook her small frame. Josie, Harrison's voice was tentative, the word carrying the weight of concern and confusion. He had never seen her this vulnerable, never seen her so consumed by grief. Josie looked up at him, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She wiped her cheeks quickly, as though ashamed of her emotions, but Harrison could see the rawness in her face. This wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper, something that had been building inside her for days, weeks, maybe even months. I don't want you to see me like this, she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked away, her shame evident in the way she pulled her knees closer to her chest. Harrison's heart ached at the sight. He wanted to tell her that it was okay to feel this way, that it was okay to cry, but he knew the words wouldn't be enough. He couldn't fix her pain. Not in a single moment. Not without understanding it. You don't have to hide from me, Josie, he said softly, taking a cautious step closer. It's okay to let it out. I'm here. Josie flinched at the words, as if the idea of opening up was terrifying to her. But Harrison didn't pull away. Instead, he sat down next to her on the couch, his presence a steady anchor as she struggled to regain control over her emotions. She didn't speak for a long time, but Harrison remained beside her, his hand resting lightly on the arm of the couch, just close enough for her to feel that he was there. Slowly, the sobs quieted, though Josie still kept her face turned away, her shoulders shaking. Harrison could feel the walls she had built up around herself, the defenses she had used to protect herself from the world and its cruelty. After a long, silent moment, Josie finally spoke. Her voice was barely audible, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. They're gone, you know, she said, her voice breaking. My mom, my dad, they're gone. They're never coming back. The words hit Harrison like a punch to the gut. He had known that Josie had lost her family, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing her say it with such quiet devastation, made the loss feel real in a way he hadn't fully understood. Josie wasn't just a scared, lost child. She was someone who had loved and been loved. She had had a family, a life before the darkness descended. I know, Josie, Harrison said softly, his voice filled with empathy and sorrow. I know. And I'm so sorry. I can't imagine the pain you're going through. Josie didn't look at him as she spoke again, but her voice was clearer, more resolute this time. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to watch. To watch your whole world burn down and have nothing left. The words stung Harrison deeply, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He didn't understand. Not fully. But he wanted to. He needed to. You're right, he said, his voice soft but unwavering. I don't know what that feels like. But I do know what it feels like to lose someone. I know what it feels like to hurt so much that it feels like you can't breathe. I know what it's like to feel like you're alone in the world. Josie turned to face him then, her eyes wide with disbelief. She seemed to be searching his face for something, as though trying to find the truth in his words. You've lost someone? Harrison nodded, his throat tightening with the memory of his own loss. Yeah. My wife, she died a few years ago. It was a hard time. I didn't know how I was going to keep going. I didn't know how to keep living. Josie's eyes softened as she looked at him, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. She had been so caught up in her own pain, so wrapped up in the memory of her family's death, that she had never considered that others might be suffering, too. Harrison's words, his honesty, seemed to break down a small part of the wall she had built around herself. Do you still miss her? Josie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison's heart thudded painfully in his chest, and for a long moment, he couldn't answer. He wasn't sure if the pain would ever truly go away, if the hole that his wife had left in his life would ever be filled. But he had learned how to live with it. He had learned how to move forward, even with the weight of the past always hanging around him like a shadow. I do, he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. I miss her every day. But I don't let that stop me from living. I don't let it stop me from being here. For you. For whatever you need. Josie didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat there, processing his words in silence. Harrison let her have that moment. It wasn't about forcing her to feel better, or making her believe everything would be okay. It was about letting her know that she wasn't alone in her pain, that even though the world could be cruel and unforgiving, there was still room for healing. There was still room for hope. Finally, Josie looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something, some sign that she could trust him with her pain. Will you stay with me? She asked, her voice small, fragile, like the first fragile leaf to fall from a tree in autumn. And in that moment, Harrison knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he would stay. No matter what happened next, no matter how long it took, he would be there for her. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice steady, reassuring. And in that moment, the first real step toward healing was taken, together. Walking through the shadows. The days seemed to stretch out like the slow, steady movement of the seasons. Time passed, though it felt almost imperceptible, as if both Josie and Harrison were suspended in some quiet, unspoken moment of transition. The autumn air outside had started to cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Inside the apartment, however, things felt different. The space felt warmer, more alive, even though the silence between them still lingered. Josie had been doing better, but Harrison could see it, the way her eyes would sometimes drift off, the shadows creeping into her thoughts, holding her back. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when Josie would laugh or smile at something small, a bird that perched on the windowsill, or a funny line in a book she'd been reading. On those days, Harrison felt the weight of her sorrow lift, just a little. But on other days, she would retreat again, the trauma creeping back into her thoughts like a dark cloud that would not go away. It was on one of those darker days that Harrison knew something had changed, something had shifted inside Josie. The evening had come quickly. Harrison had been out on his usual patrol, taking a break from his daily duties at the police station. He wasn't sure if he was looking for answers in the streets, or if he simply wanted to escape the heaviness of his own thoughts. Josie had stayed home, as she often did, though she'd been more withdrawn than usual. He had left her with a hot meal, his hope that she would eat something lingering in his mind. When he returned that evening, the apartment was unnervingly quiet. Harrison stood in the doorway for a moment, the shadows from the hallway cutting through the living room. His hand hovered over the doorknob, a slight twinge of unease flickering in his chest. "Josie," he called gently, his voice cutting through the stillness. There was no immediate response. Harrison felt the weight of his concern grow, but he didn't rush to panic. He knew Josie needed space, but there were moments when she needed someone to anchor her, someone to show her that she wasn't alone. He walked into the living room and froze. Josie was standing by the window, her back turned to him, her face hidden in the shadow of the dim light. She was staring outside, her posture stiff, as though something had overtaken her mind. Harrison could feel the tension in the room, thick like smoke, and he knew this wasn't just a moment of quiet contemplation. He stepped closer, careful not to startle her. "Josie," he said softly, his voice low and calming. "It's just me." She didn't move. Her shoulders were hunched as if she were trying to hold herself together against some invisible force. "Are you okay?" Harrison asked, his tone still gentle, but with an edge of concern. Josie didn't answer immediately. But then, slowly, she turned around, and Harrison could see the struggle in her eyes. There was a storm behind them, something she hadn't shared yet, something still locked away. The walls she had carefully built around herself were starting to crack. Her voice wavered, like the tremor of a leaf in the wind. She took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm scared, Harrison. I'm scared that if I start talking about it, I won't be able to stop. I don't know if I can handle it. I don't know if I can ever get better." Harrison's chest tightened as he approached her, keeping a safe distance, but with an unwavering presence. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so raw, and the fear that gripped her was palpable. He had seen this kind of pain before. He had felt it. "You don't have to do this all at once, Josie," Harrison said, his voice steady, his eyes full of compassion. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready. But you don't have to carry this by yourself either. You don't have to be afraid of what's inside you." Josie looked at him, her eyes wide, the fear in them not just of the past but of the future as well. "What if I can't ever get past it? What if I'm broken forever?" Harrison's heart clenched. He understood that feeling. The weight of grief, the overwhelming burden of loss, had a way of making you feel like you'd never be whole again. But the thing he had learned, the thing he would make sure Josie understood, was that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning to live with it, to give it a place in your heart without letting it consume you. "Josie, no one is broken forever," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not you. Not me. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to feel everything. But you have to know, there is so much more to you than the pain. There's so much more to you than what you've lost." She looked at him, her lips trembling as if she might speak, but the words caught in her throat. She took a step back, unsure of whether she was ready to let her guard down. Harrison watched her, giving her space, but also standing as a steady presence. "I want to help you," he said softly. "I want you to know that you don't have to fight this alone. Whatever you need, I'm here." For a long moment, Josie simply stood there, her body tense with the weight of her own struggle. Then, slowly, she nodded. It was the faintest of movements, but it was enough. I want to try," she said, her voice barely audible. "But it's hard. It's really hard." Harrison's heart swelled with a quiet sense of pride. She was trying. That was all he could ask for. In that moment, he realized that healing wasn't about finding immediate solutions, it was about taking one small step at a time. One breath, one moment of trust, one attempt to move forward. "Thank you," Harrison said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "You don't have to do anything else right now. Just know that you're not alone." The two of them stood in silence, a fragile bond growing between them. Outside the window, the city's lights flickered, and the cool night air stirred the trees, but inside, it felt different. It felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted, just a little. They weren't completely healed, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they were on the path. Together. The next morning, Josie woke earlier than usual, a quiet resolve settling over her as she stepped into the kitchen. Harrison was already there, making his coffee, the familiar routine of the morning a comforting anchor in the midst of everything. He smiled at her when she entered, a small gesture, but one that meant more than words could express. "Good morning," he said softly, his tone full of warmth. Josie gave a small smile in return, a hesitant one, but it was real. It was the first time in a long while that she hadn't been lost in her own thoughts, consumed by her past. She was still fighting the darkness, but she was doing it with a quiet strength now, not alone but with someone who cared. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still soft, but steadier than it had been before. Harrison poured her a cup of coffee, setting it down in front of her. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the hum of the apartment around them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. But there was something different about the silence today. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't full of fear. It was simply the space they needed to heal, the space they needed to understand each other. As the morning light filled the room, Josie took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the coffee spread through her. She didn't know what the future held, or if she would ever fully heal from the trauma that haunted her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. And that, for now, was enough. The path to freedom. As the weeks passed, the seasons changed, and with them, a sense of quiet transformation took root in the apartment. The city outside continued its rhythm, its hum of life moving in waves, yet inside, there was a stillness, a sense of peace, that had settled over both Josie and Harrison. It was a fragile peace, one that could easily have been shattered by the weight of their pasts, but it was also one that was undeniably real. They had been through so much together, and yet, somehow, they had managed to hold each other up. For Josie, the battle was not yet won. There were still days when the grief would surface, unexpected and sharp, like a wave crashing against the shore. But it was becoming easier to handle, easier to breathe through the moments when her heart felt too heavy, too full of sorrow. She had started to open up more, allowing herself to speak about her parents without retreating into silence, without being consumed by the memories of that night. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes, the words got stuck in her throat, tangled in the same fear that had paralyzed her for so long. But when she spoke, Harrison listened. He didn't try to fix it, to make it go away. He simply listened, holding space for her pain, his presence a constant reassurance that she wasn't alone. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the stars began to twinkle, Josie sat on the couch, a book in her lap, though her eyes were unfocused. Harrison had been out for a while, finishing up his shift at the police station. Josie had grown accustomed to the quiet, and though she missed his presence, there was something comforting about having time to herself. It gave her room to think, to process, without feeling like she had to explain herself. The silence in the room was interrupted by the sound of the door unlocking. Harrison stepped inside, his presence filling the space in a way that had become familiar, almost grounding. He looked tired, his face drawn from hours of work, but his eyes softened when he saw Josie sitting there. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted, a smile tugging at his lips despite the weariness in his voice. "Hey," Josie replied softly, setting her book aside. She smiled, though it was small, fleeting. Harrison had been patient with her over the months, giving her space, but also gently urging her to engage with life again, to find pieces of joy in the little things. Harrison walked over and sat beside her, the cushions of the couch sinking under his weight as he settled next to her. They didn't need to speak at first. The comfort of simply being together had grown in ways neither of them had anticipated. It was enough, just sitting there, with nothing required. After a few moments, Josie spoke, her voice quieter than usual but carrying an undeniable weight. "Harrison. I've been thinking about something," she said, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I think I'm ready. Ready to face what happened. To really talk about it." The words hit Harrison like a gentle wave, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. He had known this moment would come eventually. Healing didn't happen in isolation, it happened through confronting the pain, through sharing the burden. But it still felt like a monumental step. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Josie," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But if you want to talk, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Josie took a deep breath, the weight of her decision settling over her. This wasn't just about talking to Harrison, it was about confronting the fear that had controlled her for so long. It was about reclaiming pieces of herself that she had lost when her family had been taken from her. "I need to do this," she whispered. "I need to say it out loud." Harrison nodded, his hand moving gently to her shoulder, a quiet gesture of support. She had already been through so much, and he knew that whatever happened next, this was an important step for her healing. With a shaky breath, Josie began. "It was a few months ago," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom and Dad. They were always so careful. They always told me to be safe, to stay inside after dark, to never open the door for anyone we didn't know. They were paranoid, but I never understood why. I never understood that it was because of people like him. People who would come into your life and destroy it in the blink of an eye." Harrison's chest tightened, and he could see how hard it was for her to keep going, how the words felt like they were tearing her apart as she spoke. But he didn't interrupt. He let her continue, letting her say the things she had kept hidden for so long. "The night, it felt like any other night at first," Josie continued. "But then there was a knock at the door. A loud, aggressive knock. And I remember hearing my mom's voice, telling me to hide. She told me to go to my room, to stay quiet. But I didn't understand. I didn't know what was happening until I heard. I heard things breaking. I heard shouting. And then," she paused, her eyes squeezing shut as the memories threatened to overwhelm her. Harrison reached out and gently placed his hand on hers, offering the smallest of comforts. Josie took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she steadied herself. "And then it was quiet," she whispered. "Too quiet. I remember hiding in my room, trembling. I didn't know if they were still alive. I didn't know what had happened to them. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay where I had been before. So I ran." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of the loss, the terror, and the betrayal Josie had endured. Harrison felt his heart shatter for her. He had known the basics of what had happened, but hearing the story from her, hearing it through her eyes, made the reality of it even more devastating. "I'm sorry, Josie," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't even begin to imagine what that was like." Josie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes still focused on the floor. Harrison could see the exhaustion in her face, the toll this had taken on her. But there was something else there too, something new, something fragile yet powerful, a sense of release. "I'm not the same person I was," Josie said quietly. "But I think I can start to be okay again. I can start to move forward. I don't have to keep running from the past." Harrison squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a turning point. Josie had taken the hardest step, the one that many never had the strength to take, and she was learning to breathe again. They were both learning. "You don't have to do it alone, Josie," Harrison said, his voice steady, filled with conviction. "You never have to do it alone. I'll be here. Every step of the way." Josie looked up at him then, her eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. For the first time, Harrison saw not just a girl who had lost everything, but a young woman who was learning to reclaim her life. "I know," she said, her voice full of quiet strength. "I know." And for the first time in a long time, Josie felt free. She felt the weight of the past lift, just a little, and she felt ready to face the future, whatever it might hold. As the night drew on, the stars outside shone a little brighter, and the cool autumn air seemed to carry with it the promise of new beginnings. The path ahead was uncertain, but for Josie and Harrison, the journey was theirs to take together.